Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sarah Martin, and I'm from the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And today I'm excited to welcome you to our webinar to discuss CEP's new three-part research series, Foundations Respond to Crisis. This three-part effort was spurred by the Council on Foundations Pledge, published in April 2020 and signed by nearly 800 foundations, urging funders to act swiftly in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. As myriad calls grew for foundations to invest in communities hardest hit by the pandemic, namely Black, Latino, Native American, low-income and working class communities, and people with disabilities, we undertook this major research initiative with the support and collaboration of the Ford Foundation. We asked foundation leaders, what's actually changing in foundations practices, and what does this mean for the future? We hope that today's conversation with three foundation leaders and the report's lead authors will provide further insight into how foundations have responded and continue to respond as the pandemic wears on, and what these changes mean for philanthropy as a whole. Next, I'd like to share a few housekeeping items for our time today. First, you may have noticed we are in webinar format, which means all of you are muted and have your videos off for the duration. If you have questions for the panelists during today's presentation, and we certainly hope that you do, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel. We'll also be sharing some resources with you via the chat box, so feel free to check there for helpful links. We will not be using the hand raising function on the webinar, as we are not asking attendees to speak their questions. And we're pleased to offer live captioning during this webinar today, so if you'd like to enable live captioning, please click the closed captioning button towards the bottom of your screen in your Zoom panel. If for any reason you require technical assistance, please reach out to my colleague, Say Darling, via email at saed@cep.org, and he can assist you. We are recording this webinar, and we will send a link to all attendees in a follow-up email. Finally, as a nonprofit, CEP relies heavily on grant funding and individual donations, in addition to earned revenue from our assessments. I hope you'll listen today and consider supporting CEP's work, whether it be by underwriting a new piece of research, like the research we're discussing today, inquiring about a foundation assessment, or a simple dues-like financial gift. We'll be sharing a few links in the chat box on how to get in touch with us, so thank you in advance. And now I'm thrilled to introduce you to the moderator for today's discussion, CEP President Phil Buchanan. Phil?
Thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome to everybody. We are so pleased to have so many funders on this webinar. As of yesterday, there were 570 some folks who had registered. So I'll be moderating today and engaging the panelists, as well as bringing in as many questions from all of you as I can, as Sarah just mentioned. And we have a great group of panelists. CEP's Naomi Orenston and Ellie Buteau will share research findings on how foundations responded to the crises of 2020. And then we'll bring into the discussion some incredibly thoughtful philanthropic leaders to help react to and make sense of what we learned in our research, and to discuss what gives them hope, what maybe is a little bit more sobering, and what funders best do to make the most positive difference in this moment of tremendous challenge. Marcella Tillett, VP of Programs and Partnerships at the Brooklyn Community Foundation, Nora Moreno-Karji, President of the Tufts Health Plan Foundation, and Chris Cardona, Senior Program Officer for Philanthropy at the Ford Foundation. Speaking of the Ford Foundation, I want to acknowledge their support again, and indeed initiation of this project. Chris and his colleagues, including Darren Walker, Hillary Pennington, Kathy Rich, Bess Rothenberg, and others, recognized in the early days of the pandemic that it would call for, really demand, a different approach to philanthropy. And they acted to encourage new approaches that were fitting to the moment, and also to study the degree to which new approaches were really being adopted. And that's where we came in, and we're grateful to have been funded to do the first phase of this research, which we'll hear about today in 2020, and with the support of the additional funders listed here to undertake a second phase next year. So I hope that today we can talk about what has happened, drawing on these research findings, as well as what needs to happen going forward. We're looking backward at 2020 in order to look ahead in 2021 and beyond. It's hardly possible to overstate the challenge of the moment. A hard to fathom 375,000 Americans dead and approaching 2 million worldwide of COVID-19. Parents, grandparents, siblings, friends, neighbors, co-workers, individual people with individual stories. We should not let ourselves become inured to this loss by the sheer scale of it. Early on in the spring, in the early days of the pandemic here in the United States, it was clear that COVID was infecting and killing Black, Latino, and Native peoples at massively disproportionate rates. It was similarly clear that the economic impacts were just as disparate. The late spring and summer, of course, brought a national reckoning on structural racism and inequities, spurred by the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police and countless other Black people, and by the anguish of hundreds of years of inequities and racism infecting every aspect of American life. If ever there was a time when it was clear, as Lincoln put it, that the quiet dogmas of the past were inadequate to the stormy present, it was surely 2020. And so the question was how could institutional philanthropy respond? And as we discuss that today, it's worth acknowledging that the atmosphere of crisis gripping this country did not take a break just because we all wished it to as we celebrated closing the book on 2020. Last Wednesday, we all saw a terrorist mob that included white nationalists, avowed racists, and anti-Semites hell-bent on violence and on overturning the results of a democratic election storm the US Capitol, egged on by the president and by members of Congress. And we saw, yet again, in full and vivid display, the shocking disparity in how threatening both individuals and groups are perceived by law enforcement. Or as Isabel Wilkerson put it on Twitter, we saw caste in action. And while we were all shocked by the scenes, none of us should have been remotely surprised. And so here we are on January 12th, 2021. Philanthropy has a crucial role in this country's next chapter. And we see some signs, as we will hear, of real response and reaction by philanthropic institutions, both in who is funded and in how. Increased support to specific communities of color and organizations led by people from those communities, as well as a relaxation of restrictions and reporting requirements for grantees. And for most foundations in our study, increased grant spending in 2020 beyond what was budgeted, though the increases were modest. So real and meaningful responses. And yet, also sobering realities that the percentage of multi-year unrestricted grants made by foundations is lower than the percentage of applicants admitted to Harvard Law School, no joke. And our data suggests that while the crisis spurred more unrestricted support, it didn't spur more multi-year support. Or this, that well over half of foundations have boards that are 3/4 or more white today, in this country today. With that background, let me hand it now to Naomi and Ellie, who will walk through what we learned. The results are also described in 3 reports that are on our website, cep.org, free for folks to download. Sarah will put the specific link in the chat at some point. And before we hear from Ellie and Naomi, I just want to thank them and also the other members of the CEP research team, Hannah Martin, Satya Maratha, Kate Gelling, and Katarina Malgram, for the work that went into this project, as well as the other efforts to be a resource to funders during this time of crisis. So Naomi, you want to start us off?
Thanks, Phil. So Hi, everybody. As my colleagues referenced, amidst these crises have come numerous calls for fundamental changes in how funders approach their work. Building on past efforts in the sector, funders have been increasingly urged to provide flexible funding, shift the power dynamic, trust nonprofits, increase their payout, and invest in communities hit hardest, particularly communities of color. And following the murder of George Floyd and also building on years of advocacy in the sector, funders have also been increasingly urged to address anti-Black racism and to focus more on racial equity and racial justice. So one of these calls, of course, is the pledge, a call to action, philanthropy's commitment during COVID-19, launched on the Council on Foundations website in late March. This pledge, spurred by leaders at the Ford Foundation and informed by those involved in the trust-based philanthropy project, charged funders to act with, as you can see here on the slide, fierce urgency to support their nonprofit partners and the people and communities hit hardest. Nearly 800 signatories have pledged to loosen or eliminate grant restrictions, reduce what is asked of nonprofits, make new grants as unrestricted as possible, and listen to partners and communities least heard. And so given all these calls for change, the question becomes, what's actually changing in foundation practice? And what does this mean for the long term? More specifically, this research effort sought to explore these research questions. How are foundations responding to these crises? What high-level changes are they making in their work? And also, what specific ways are foundations supporting their grantees differently? How are foundation leaders responding to inequities exacerbated by the pandemic, and how are they reckoning with racism? And of course, what does this mean for the future of foundation philanthropy? Will foundation leaders make changes permanent, or will they return to old practices over time? To answer these questions, we collected data from a variety of sources. This summer, we surveyed more than 800 leaders from foundations who did and who did not sign the pledge. Many of the questions that we asked were based on pledge elements. From those that signed the pledge, we received response rates that are fairly typical, 39%. We received a lower response rate, 16%, from those that did not sign the pledge. We also interviewed 41 leaders and staff from foundations that did sign the pledge. I do want to acknowledge here some likely response bias. Given that we heard more from those who signed the pledge, these findings likely overrepresent foundations that have publicly committed to taking action. I want to walk through the main themes from the study that Ellie and I will be sharing today. First, these crises have catalyzed foundation leaders to reconsider their choices about how they conduct their work and have pushed them to accelerate change efforts already underway. Second, most told us that they increased their giving in 2020. Most foundation leaders said that they changed their practices to be more flexible and more responsive. Almost all respondents said they are placing new or more of a focus on the communities most affected, especially Black, Latino, and lower income communities. Most foundation leaders said that they are also reckoning with racism and paying greater attention to racial equity in their work. These themes certainly suggest that there's some reason for optimism. Foundations, as institutions often perceived as notoriously process-heavy and resistant to change, say that they are making significant changes. Of course, it remains to be seen how deep or sustained these changes will be. And throughout this presentation, Ellie and I will flag where there's opportunity for improvement and also areas where there's good reason for some skepticism. Interviewees overwhelmingly described that the events of recent months have prompted them to reevaluate and quickly how they approach their work and to incorporate new and different practices with less of a focus on traditional norms. About 60% of interviewees told us that these crises have pushed them to accelerate change efforts already underway. As one leader told us, this has been a wake-up moment for philanthropy. Further, interviewees described that these changes haven't been particularly challenging. They've learned that they can adapt, simplify, and be flexible with grantees. As you see here on the slide, one said, "When the will to make changes exists, we found we were able to make changes very quickly." These past months have also seen numerous calls for foundations to significantly increase their payout. When these surveys were administered in the summer, 21% of respondents had not yet decided whether they would change their 2020 grant-making levels from what had been previously budgeted for the year. Among those that had decided, 72% said they increased their 2020 grant-making relative to what had been previously budgeted, and leaders described that this is the rainy day and that their resources are needed now. As one leader said, as you can see up here on the slide, the organizations we partner with need more. Foundations have been able to recover from past recessions, but some communities have not. Yet, as Phil shared, the increases were rather modest. Among those that said they increased their giving, 41% did so by 10% or less. And foundations, regardless of whether or not they signed the pledge, say they are making significant changes in response to these crises. The most frequent change, as you can see here on the screen, that they said that they're making is loosening and eliminating grant restrictions, making new grants as unrestricted as possible, and reducing what is asked of grantees. It seems prudent to note that these calls for greater flexibility and greater responsiveness are not new. Nonprofit leaders have long been asking their funders to incorporate these practices. Yet, as you can see here in the orange bars, these practices for more than half of the foundations in our study are new. I want to quickly touch on what isn't changing much. Even as funders are making many changes and providing more unrestricted funding, they're not making much change with regard to grant duration. Multi-year general operating support grants are the grants that nonprofit leaders see as the most helpful. But here on the slide, you can see that more than 70% of survey respondents said they made no change in their provision of multi-year GOS in response to these crises. And the million-dollar question, of course, is whether this moment will result in lasting change. This is something we'll be closely studying in the second phase of this research. And as you can see here in this middle yellowish bar, among foundations that began being more flexible and responsive in response to the pandemic, more than half said that they will continue these practices in at least some of their program areas. However, most foundations report that they will do so to a lesser degree than their current pandemic practice. Furthermore, looking at the orange bar here, about 30% are unsure whether or not they will continue these practices in the future. Some are optimistic that this moment will bring more transformative change for philanthropy, more than, as one leader put it, tinkering on the edges. One noted, as you can see here on the slide, we treat our processes like they came down from the mountain with Moses, like they're embedded on tablets. They're not. They were made up by us. And this moment has called those processes into question. The majority of interviewees did express a hope that foundations won't return to their past practices after these crises fade. Whether that occurs, of course, remains to be seen. All right, Ellie, I'm going to pass it on over to you.
Thank you, Naomi. Almost 90% of the foundations surveyed reported making new efforts to support organizations serving communities that were most affected by the public health and economic consequences of COVID-19. Most frequently, they report directing new funding to Black, Latino, and lower income communities. For example, in the first line of this chart, you see that 75% of foundations in the study report new funding to nonprofits serving Black or African American communities. In the next chart, fewer foundations have made new efforts to support other communities hard hit by the pandemic, including Native communities, Asian communities, and people with disabilities. In fact, in interviews, no foundations mentioned the topic of disability in relation to any question we asked. About 2/3 of survey respondents reported that prior to the pandemic, their foundation was supporting organizations created and led by executive directors from communities now hardest hit by the pandemic. They were, however, dedicating only a small percentage of grant dollars to these communities. 59% of foundations surveyed say they've been giving a higher percentage of grant dollars to organizations created and led by CEOs from communities most affected by the pandemic. In this chart, in orange, you'll see that they most frequently report giving a higher percentage of grant dollars to organizations created and led by CEOs from Black, lower income, and Latino communities. Few foundations report increasing the percentage of grant dollars going toward other communities, such as Asian communities, Native communities, and people with disabilities. And I do want to note in this second table, in the last column, that a sizable percentage say they're unsure of whether they've changed the percentage of grant dollars going to organizations, particularly those in this second chart. In interviews, over 80% of foundations reported making changes that incorporate racial equity into their grant making or programmatic strategies. When it comes to what was happening inside foundations in 2020, at the time of our interviews, leaders more frequently described their foundations as reflecting on and learning about racial equity. Only about 50% reported making changes related to racial equity in their internal practices. Moving forward, about 90% of interviewed foundations said they'll be focusing more on racial equity, recognizing that they have more work to do. As one foundation leader said, no matter what the issue that a foundation is trying to move the needle on, racism is likely impacting their ability to get the results they want. And so, if they have not understood, acknowledged, or sought to address this, then they're missing an integral part of the problem that they're trying to solve through their philanthropy. When it comes to foundation boards, racial diversity is lacking. On most boards represented in our survey data, less than 25% of their board members are people of color. Yet in interviews, leaders at only 12% of the foundations that we spoke with proactively raised the need for their board to be more racially diverse. Across more than 20 variables in our survey, we saw a pattern of differences in foundation practices, such that foundations with more racially diverse boards tend to be slightly more likely to engage in certain practices. And these include modifying grant application processes to reach more organizations led by those from the communities most affected by the pandemic, supporting organizations serving communities most affected, making changes based on grantee feedback, using their own voice to support advocacy, proactively converting restricted funding to unrestricted funding, accelerating payment schedules, and reducing, simplifying, or postponing reporting requirements. To be clear, we're not necessarily saying this is a causal relationship, that more diverse boards cause these things to happen. There certainly could be other variables at play here, such as the values or beliefs of the CEO or a foundation's history and values. Separately, we looked for but did not find differences in the survey data when it comes to whether the person leading the foundation identified as a person of color. In summary, our research showed us that foundations have reported making many changes to their work in 2020, but it remains to be seen how committed foundation leaders are to maintaining certain changes. In 2020, the majority of foundations reported increasing their payout levels above the levels they had budgeted before the pandemic. They report increasing the flexibility of their funding and their level of responsiveness to grantees, though, as Naomi mentioned, they aren't sure for how long those changes will last. Foundations also report new funding to communities most affected in 2020, especially Black, Latino, and lower income communities. It remains to be seen if that funding will continue. This study reveals potentially significant oversights when it comes to communities that have received less support in response to the pandemic, such as Native communities, Asian communities, and those with disabilities. The momentum behind foundation leaders' desire to support progress in racial equity seems strong, but there is plenty of reason for skepticism, including that few foundation leaders we spoke with mentioned the increasing racial diversity of their board as a priority. Looking ahead, this year, we'll be conducting a second phase of this research to address in what ways the crises of 2020 will influence foundations longer term, what factors might help or hinder foundations from implementing more permanent changes, how foundations are continuing to reckon with racism, and how they are changing their practices to focus more on racial equity and racial justice, and whether foundations are continuing to be more responsive and flexible with their grantees. This report from this research, the second phase of research, will be published at the end of this year. And with that, I will turn it over to Phil to lead a panel discussion.
And Ellie, don't go away yet. Before I'd like to ask the panelists to come on. As they do, thank you so much, Ellie and Naomi. As they do, can you just speak, Ellie, to, and Naomi sort of alluded to this, but to any limitations of this research? So, for example, people are listening and saying, well, those who signed the pledge, responded at a higher rate than those who didn't. So to what extent, how do we think about that, about sort of how representative is this, or does this likely overrepresent, those who made change? What's your take on that as a researcher?
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible that this data, and I would say likely, right, that this data overrepresents those that have made changes. I think that in much of our research, that is probably the case, not just this particular study, but that potentially foundations with a greater interest in making changes on the very topics that we asked about were more likely to respond. I think that's my take on it. I don't have data to support that, but logically that's what I would say.
Yeah, that's great. That's just helpful. I mean, it's obviously a large number of foundations that responded. So it's telling us something about the universe of folks who responded, which is significant. So thank you, Ellie. And I'm going to bring you and Naomi back, into this conversation a little later as we may return to some of the data and methodology questions. But I want to welcome now Marcella, Nora, and Chris. Thank you. And maybe just to start, if this isn't too hokey, like if you could just put yourself on a scale of your feelings on a scale of 1 to 7 of how encouraged or discouraged you are about the data that you just heard. When you look at foundations and how they responded to the crises of 2020, where 1 is totally discouraged and 7 is totally encouraged, where would you place yourself and why? And maybe Marcella, if I could ask you to start.
Sure. And again, thank you to Center for Effective Philanthropy for having me. Very excited to be in conversation with you. I would say a 4.5. I am encouraged.
I wondered if we'd use the decimals.
I have to ask for a 0.5
yeah,
just to
that's
be difficult.
Great. Sorry, continue.
But yeah, so I think I'm feeling encouraged because not just because of what we saw in 2020 in terms of changes within philanthropic institutions, but there was a new level of accountability within the sector and calling institutions in to have better practices. That's what I find encouraging, because I think that doesn't just leave the responsibility to an individual institution, but it shows that there's a potential wave of change within the sector. I'm tentative because, and that's why it's still 4.5, because there is a flavor of the moment kind of norm in this sector. And so that's why I'm not so sure.
Right, that's great. Nora? What's your take?
So I want to be optimistic. We are hearing language that we have not heard before. Systemic racism. Let's just pause there, reflect and think about that. For the sector to be calling it out like that is, when I read the reports again, I felt like, here we're using the language that we haven't heard used before, right? Barriers, right? I don't want to hear barriers. I want to hear that there has been a deliberate attempt by systems to keep people out. And so that is changing in the sector, and the calling out of racism. And so language is really important. And though I have to say that I'm with Marcella, it's like the flavor of the month, What will happen? Will we now hear calls for civic engagement and, a supportive media, true and transparent media because of what we saw happen with all this disinformation that occurred during these crises. And so I am hopeful because of the language, but I am cautious because we've heard this all before. I mean, you said it in your remarks, Phil. We're not surprised, right? What did we expect? This is the fruition of what we have known, and now we need to act. So enough talk, and let's move to action. So yeah.
Thanks, Nora. So it's sort of 4.5. That's what it sounds like to me. Yeah, very, very helpful. Chris, what's your take?
Yeah, I'll add another 4.5. It's funny, as Marcella was saying that, I was like, yes, exactly. In between.
Let me just calculate that average.
There you go. There you go. That one will require independent verification. Yeah, and for similar reasons, right? There is more forthrightness, maybe not as much as we would be well served by, in terms of being very direct about what are the forces that are shaping the conflict in our society right now. But what's striking for me is, taking into account the possible, the bias that that Ellie and you talked about, Phil. How remarkable, and this was one of the quotations, how easy these changes ended up being, right? That we and especially at a larger foundation, it does take a lot you can take a lot to change things. We tell ourselves that is a reality, and we're also able to change very quickly. The social justice bond that we issued earlier this year which was I think a new thing in the field, came together in the space of about 3 months. So when there's small p political will and commitment within an institution, we can move and we can change our practices quickly, especially in the usual scale of the field. So I am definitely encouraged to see that, and also our folks engaging in the internal reflection about, hey, wait a minute, why was this so hard for us to do when all of a sudden it looked so easy? And so that is what I wonder about with regard to, are these changes going to stick? Are they accompanied by internal reflection about what led us to not being flexible?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And actually, to me, that's why the board issue is so important. Who's on the board? And, an open question to me is, how much change can there be until, and I mean this, not to diss the experience and knowledge of those who serve on foundation boards, but just to state that at most large foundations, the diversity is sorely lacking, as we saw, not just racial diversity, but also diversity of experience, knowledge of philanthropy and the nonprofit side, and so on. And obviously there are exceptions. Ford Foundation would be one where the board looks more diverse than a lot of foundation boards. And Chris, you alluded to the board supporting the bond that led the foundation to be able to get more resources out the door. As you think about the changes at the foundation last year in 2020, was that the most significant, do you think, for Ford?
I mean, you're asking me as someone in the trenches of grant making, the fact that we doubled our grant making in 2020 and 21 as a result of that, while not adding headcount. Sure, from my perspective, that does look like the most significant one. But zooming out, yeah, I would say that it is, because it reflects an overall doubling down on the strategies and the approaches and the analysis that we had previously, right? We're about disrupting the drivers of inequality, right? And that it's political and economic and cultural and they social and they relate to each other. And so you have to support a combination of base builders and organizers and knowledge producers and culture shapers to disrupt those drivers. So the social justice bond essentially enabled us to raise more money from the capital markets, from the bond market specifically, to do a lot more of that, right? Sort of double down on those existing strategies. So yeah, I would say that's the that's the biggest shift in the past year.
Thank you. And Nora, what would you say at Tufts Health Foundation? What was the most significant change or shift?
Yeah, I think, you know, it's interesting because we talked about it a little bit in the pre-call, and I feel like just a matter of asking. You know, we actually went down into our endowment, right? There's this, right, this standard. Oh, well, we can only spend X number of dollars, 5% minimum, you know, to support. And when we saw this pandemic adversely affect the people that we focused on, older adults, it was like, if not now, when? And to be able to go to the board and say, you know, we talk about the value of being relevant and responsive. And in this moment, that just by asking, you know, it was like, you know, usually they're really, you know, timid and, well, you know, what does this mean in terms of the endowment? And you know, the response is, doesn't matter what it means. In this moment, people are suffering and we need to be responsive. And if we're saying that as the only regional funder in the Northeast, we're seeing these things adversely affect our population, then we need to act now. And by asking and having them respond in a positive way, it was just really gratifying and rewarding and just humbling to have our board be right there, present, and understanding that this was the right thing to do in this moment. So asking was the big thing, right, for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Did you have anybody who, because often I think foundation boards will focus on kind of the peak, you know, purchasing power, real value of the endowment, like whatever it was at whatever moment that happened. Anything else feels like, you know, we're down from that. And there, which of course, you know, rather than trying to preserve, you know, roughly the value since inception or whatever. And then obviously, so there's that. And then there's also the, well, what will this mean for future generations? So you sort of alluded to that. Did you have folks who made those arguments, and or are you saying
Certainly.
that it was a quick decision?
Right, when you go to the board, well, it was a quick decision. We actually were off cycle, didn't have a meeting, and did the unanimous consent over email. We weren't going to wait. But I would say that it is talking about the foundation historically. We're small. We're like 110 million, not a lot of money. But enough to say, look, if not now, again, when, right? And to say at the same time, we have been able to invest nearly $60 million since our inception, and we actually have more because we go to our company and we ask them to invest more. You know, we say, you had a good year, why not give the foundation more? You know, and it's in the asking that we're realizing that people will say, you know, yes, there'll be tough times, but if you look at the history of this foundation, we've been able to invest all these resources and we're kind of up. So yes, it was a multi-tiered argument, pitch, if you will, but we acted quickly and who would, I guess the other thing is, like, I look at my board and I'm proud to say that we're over 50% diverse. I am proud to say that they just got it right away. And it was like within 24 hours that we got consent. And so I'm really, really fortunate to have the folks on board that we have. And so, but you know, you're always, well, what will they say? And will they say yes? And should I be asking? I just asked the other day, you know, it's like for more money. And so, yeah, there are those moments where you're reluctant, but you know, we don't have because we don't ask. And the more we ask, I think that that we'll know whether or not we have a board and whether or not we have work to do to convince the board about what's important in community.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's so right. I mean, you got to go to the board and ask for what you think is needed. So Marcella, you're in a somewhat different position, obviously, than Chris or Nora. You're at a community foundation. Mm-hmm. Community foundations, in my view, played this really incredible role during this crisis of, you know, bridging donors who wanted to
Yeah.
do something and didn't know where to begin, and organizations serving the communities that have been most significantly impacted. As you look at your 2020, what did the Brooklyn Community Foundation do to change that you think was most significant?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because we are always questioning at Brooklyn Community Foundation, how can we be fulfilling our mission more in a more robust way? We have been committed to doing our work through a racial equity lens for many years now. And the question of what does that mean beyond words has been part of our practice. How do we operationalize that has been part of our practice for several years. And in 2020, we really saw that as an opportunity to dig deeper in that space. Nora, when you were talking about your board and the need to ask and really be upfront about reflecting the needs that they may not see, what came to mind for us was the creation of our Brooklyn COVID-19 Response Fund, which we launched very quickly in early March. And that conversation actually started at the board level because the unique nature of being a community foundation is you are attached to a place. And this is not just a place that institutionally we're dedicated to. This is a place where we all live, where our children go to school, where we walk around, we have relationships, our families are here. So the connectedness to the impact of a place is very real for us, for our board and for our staff, and of course for our community partners. So the launch of the fund in the second week of March, after kind of having early March conversations about what's coming, was led by the board. And so that was a really exciting feature of 2020 to see that strong leadership right out of the gate. And we didn't know what was coming. None of us did. We couldn't really predict this, but what we did know was that whatever was coming was going to hit Black and Brown communities hardest, because it always does, right? There's the saying, if America gets a cold, Black communities get pneumonia. We knew that anything that was going to come, whether it was a health crisis, an economic crisis, a social crisis, our communities would bear the brunt of it. So we reached out first to say, what are you experiencing? How are you responding? And how can we help? And that I think was different, that immediate, well, not so different. We've done that before. We had a Hurricane Sandy response fund. So that kind of immediate response muscle is present. But something that we did do that was very unique that we developed in 2020 was what we call an equity filter, where one of the things we were concerned about was not just how do we fund COVID response projects that are specific to the new needs being presented by the pandemic. In addition to that, we were concerned with nonprofit sustainability. So our community partners who are doing critical work that is impacted by the pandemic, because everything is, but not in a specific response to it, how do we shore them up, knowing that there were projections that, high percentages of nonprofits are expected to close, and we have seen that in 2020 going into 2021. So we developed these sustainability enhancement grants, which provided a percentage of their current grant amount in an additional payment. And it was a range of 15, 20, or 25%. And we developed an equity filter to determine whether those grantees would get a 15% bump, a 20% bump, or a 25% bump. And we looked at the budget size of the organization, the racial identity of the executive director, the number of board members, and the percentage of individual giving that their annual fundraising relied on, because we knew that those factors would dictate and really influence their ability to weather a storm, an economic storm. And they're kind of give an indication of their access to wealth and wealth networks. And that filter is something we've continued to use beyond those sustainability enhancement grants, but to make decisions about all matter of additional support. And so that's, again, another way that we're operationalize what racial equity looks like in philanthropy.
That's a really great practical sort of approach, that is distinct from, and not criticizing other responses, but, in the early days, you saw some funders who sort of just stepped up sort of added on by the same percentage, to every grantee, rather than differentiating, based on the kind of circumstances that you describe. I guess I want to focus for a minute here on this whole issue of, you talked about a racial equity lens in grant making, and maybe if for all three of you, can we talk about what it actually looks like to incorporate a focus on racial equity into strategy, right? And so I guess there's a difference, right, in a response of a funder who, let's say, has an education and environment program that's been going along, neither of which have really contemplated race. This is a hypothetical example, but it wouldn't be hard to find in real life. Even though, it's hard to imagine how in the United States you work on education without engaging issues of the disparate resources that people bring when they come in the door, or the school discipline data, which shows the way racism impacts school discipline, or how on the environment, like how you really engage without engaging the disproportionate exposure to toxins of, people of color, et cetera. And yet a lot of, if you read strategies, in those areas, you will see, pretty in-depth strategic documents that don't talk about race, right? And so then we have 2020, and you see some of those funders say, okay, we have this new, sort of racial equity thing, right? And that's great. It's more grant making going out the door, or it's a response. But how can we talk a little bit, just bring you in your perspective on how do you get folks to actually integrate the race analysis into their strategies in existing areas, as opposed to doing it kind of over here, if that makes sense? And anybody can start.
So I'll go. I just feel like that. So to say that this is the thing that we do over here is already wrong, right? I would say, and also, you want to do that thing over there. We tried this, and we have this great collaboration, multi-sector addressing aging. And when we did that, when we had a separate strategy, it didn't get done. Didn't get done. We talked about it. We said it was important. When we said we need to embed this in everything we do, like look at communities. What is their racial profile? Like, why would we go in that community? Like, who is in who? We didn't want to be the foundation, right? That created that larger gap between those communities that had and those communities that didn't have, right? And so I think it has to be deliberate and embedded in everything you do. And so it goes from looking at zip codes, looking at communities of color. For us in Massachusetts, it's the gateway communities, right? Because those are the working class, mostly majority. And I don't want to say majority minority, because, we're coming for you. Latinos are the fastest growing, and between Latinos, Blacks, and Asians, we're almost there. And so I feel like we have to also talk about it in terms of, people of color, communities that have been disproportionately affected. And we know, as Marcella said, it's like, oh, we all can remember in the early days, everyone was saying, wow, I can't believe it. Communities of color are disproportionately affected. It's like, I was aghast that people were acting like this was a surprise. And so it's like, let's not be surprised. And, wouldn't it be brave if more and more philanthropies would say, you know what, we're only going to focus on communities of color. We're only going to look at and have that be the goal that we want to get to. And when we see it, as a again, a health funder and someone who we are the foundation that belongs to an insurer. And so we have to think about the health and well-being of all communities that we serve, but let's focus on the diverse communities that we serve, which is embedded in our mission. And so I would say just let's rethink that and say it should be a part of all that we do.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that got said a lot in the early days, and I want to bring Chris in for his thoughts on this, is, it's not only, oh boy, what a surprise, but also it's exposing, inequities and of course, what is really important, and I feel like, there's been more recognition of this, is that it is exacerbating them in ways that could last generations without aggressive steps being taken, right? So if you were, so it's not just a today issue, it's a what happens to the family that took a huge step back in 2020 economically. What does that mean for their 2025? So, but Chris, how do you think about this? Because obviously Ford Foundation has made, issues of equity central to your work. Talk a little bit about how that gets connected to other goals, whether in education, environment, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. For us, it started with a deliberate process, and a little bit we fell prey to the challenge that nonprofits experience with funders of, when they say, we're undergoing strategic planning, run for the hills or make sure that your grant is secured, right? But I think in this case, it was important that across the foundation, including our global offices, we really got aligned on this idea of what the drivers of inequality are, right? And I can never remember all 5 of them, but they're about political, economic, cultural, and social inequality. One that always stands out for me is cultural narratives that undermine fairness and inclusion. And for us to all get on the same page about the interaction of those. Another is about discrimination based on identity and names different kinds of identity. That was a really crucial moment to get aligned on the interconnectedness of the different issues, even as we were starting to focus ever more narrowly on particular topic areas. To have that broad and comprehensive framework was really key, so that we're encouraged to see the different issues. And I really relate to the dilemma of the siloing that you talked about before, that sometimes it gets described as mainstream, right? And you see it across different domains. And this gets to how are different things connected. Like within gender mainstream, disability inclusion, race, right? So we have a program on gender, racial, and ethnic justice. And there was a lot of debate within the framework about inequality, about whether to have that be its own standalone thing or to aspire to have it be mainstreamed within the foundation. And we chose to have it be its own dedicated program area, and that has been productive. We've done amazing work on ending mass incarceration, among other things. But when an outgoing director of that program a few years back was doing her final reflection with the folks in the foundation, she was saying, we still have progress to do on mainstream. So it feels like with disability inclusion, we've started to learn more about that. And a lot of it has to do with not only dedicated staffing, but also setting up incentives and direction from the top about the importance of this issue. So over a 2 or 3 year period, we introduced, said it was coming, then it was here, and now it's being implemented, that there would be targets around disability inclusive grant making within the foundation. But we provided, the president's office for a couple of years, provided some matching funds to programs as an incentive. At first as a like, hey, the requirement's coming, it's not here yet, but it'll be here next year. So you might want to start, building up your pipeline. And that ended up playing out. So I would say this is a recurrent challenge across different dimensions of equity, and you can learn from the experience of different ones. That's another way not to be siloed, right? Racial equity, gender equity, disability inclusion, LGBTQ inclusion, all of these different dimensions can speak to each other, and mainstreaming is a recurrent dilemma across them, but we can learn from those experiences as we advance those different aims.
So that's really helpful. And I'm going to ask Naomi and Ellie to come back in now. We have 15 more minutes and we're going to bring in some questions. As we do that though, and speaking of silos, Marcella, you and I have talked about the tendency to sort of silo the investment side from the program side. And you have a point of view on that. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about that and how you would encourage foundations to think about the the chunk of money that is not going out the door in grants every year.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that's something that I think 2020 has also that wave has brought forth new conversations about use of assets towards mission in a way that, again, echoes this: what more can we do? How can we really show up? And I know within my foundation, that's a question, again, we're always asking. But I think there's some strong modeling, particularly within community foundations and our kind of area of the sector. There's some strong models of what that looks like to put more of your assets to bear towards your mission. And if I can, I just want to also touch on something that Chris said about kind of routinizing a racial analysis and an equity lens in your work. I think it's really important. And I love that another thing 2020 has brought us is the ability to, without hesitation, say that white supremacy and anti-Blackness is foundational to our country and our systems. And that doesn't make anyone flinch anymore. And if as a foundation or a philanthropic institution, you are dedicated to working towards equity and justice, there is a connection between structural change and achieving equity and justice. That's what that's referring to, right? And if we are all in agreement that race is guiding and very foundational to how people are impacted by systems, that analysis, I think, should, and for us it definitely does, drives us to go to where the most harm is from these systems, right? So when we look at where do we invest, where do we partner, what leaders do we, want to make sure we support, we are going to those who are most impacted and most harmed by these systems, and also most generative in building power to combat those things. And just in 2020 alone, we were talking about kind of the relationships between donors and organizations. We've been able to fund 150 new organizations in 2020 alone and build relationships with over 1,600 new donors. And this is just in the borough of Brooklyn. So we're an amazing community foundation, but if we can do it, others can do it as well. There just has to be that sustained commitment to the work. We're doing that with our strategic and discretionary funds, and we want to kind of feel that wave of a fuller asset approach that we're seeing across the sector, and definitely across the community foundation area of the sector.
Thanks, Marcella. I want to bring in some questions. A lot of questions have been submitted, and there's still time for you to submit a question if you have one. And Naomi and Ellie, I want to bring you back into the conversation. One of the things that people, want to know again is, okay, so like, what were the most common changes again? I know you described that, but just to hit on those. And sub question to that, did that vary by foundation type? So for example, were family foundations much less likely or more likely, to change, or big to small? What did we see in the data? So the two parts to that question. Don't know which one of you wants to take that.
Happy to take that one, Ellie. So broadly, we looked for differences in responses by foundation type and also by foundation size, and we did not see statistically significant differences. With regard to the most frequent changes that foundations are making, the top two changes are reducing what is asked of grantees. So, simplifying, reducing reporting requirements, and also loosening or eliminating grant restrictions. So those are things like accelerating payment schedules or not holding grantees accountable for missed aims. And the third most frequent change that foundations told us that they are making is making new grants as unrestricted as possible.
And another thing that people seem to really want to understand, which thanks, Naomi, that's super helpful, is like, do we know anything about which ones are more likely to stick? Is there anything in the data we've gathered that gives us insight on that, or will we only know, in the future?
I can take that. Yeah,
Great, Ellie. Thanks.
I would say from that research, as Naomi shared some of this in her presentation, we had foundations predicting some of what they thought would stick, but I would say that the data that we collect this year will probably give us a more accurate picture of what, in fact, they have continued to do as time has gone on. The data that we collected was last spring and summer, quite early in the pandemic, and so I think many foundations, as Naomi had mentioned, still weren't sure what they were going to do.
Nora, did you want to jump in on that or no? No. Okay.
Actually have a thought on that.
Yes, Marcella.
Bill, that I wanted to share, because I was thinking about that when Ellie and Naomi were going over the data, and that 30% of respondents that weren't sure if they were going to stick. It struck me that, again, thinking about accountability and how to pull folks in and hold them there as we try to, see progress in our sector. There were 800 signatories to the pledge, right? It was a one-time commitment and an intention setting opportunity. I wonder, and I think that there is an opportunity to re-engage with them in a way that challenges them to kind of define what crisis is. Undoubtedly, 2020 was a crisis. For many communities, they have been in crisis for many years. So I think the threshold in defining, well, when is the crisis over, is going to be, it should be a difficult conversation. A new year does not mean the crisis is over. Widespread opening of, society again does not mean crisis is over. So I think engaging in that conversation about this new commitment being tied to a state of crisis, and how are you defining crisis, and what is your threshold, and what is your comfort level as an institution to be okay with a level of crisis in the communities or in the service areas that you work in.
That's a great, really, really great comment with a very practical potential, next step, which is to reconvene, or reconnect with, those who pledged and to change their practice and engage exactly that conversation. There's a lot of questions that relate to the research, Ellie and Naomi, which I think is a good sign. Wanting to know the degree to which collaboration came up. So we've all seen, examples of funders, and indeed there was a level of collaboration to the social equity bond, right, Chris? I mean, this was done in concert with other foundations, that 4 others. But is that something we got much insight into from? I know from our past research, when we talk to foundation CEOs about what they think is holding back foundations from making more of an impact, in the past they've said, well, we're not very good at collaborating because it's always about, like, I want you to collaborate with me in exactly the way that I define. But did we hear much about that in this study?
Yeah, we did. In interviews, about half of the foundations that we spoke with emphasized the importance of more and better collaboration and more working together, both when it comes to, funder collaboration and partnership, but also how funders are collaborating, coordinating, partnering with the nonprofits, that are on the ground doing the work.
So I just want to add that, we funded a study like really early on where we saw collaboration be the core of how communities actually were able to better respond, right, to the pandemic, and then sharing those learnings with other communities as it was happening. And so real time, we did this with FSG and 6 of the communities most affected by the pandemic in Massachusetts, and released the report in a way that they could share with other communities to sort of say, this is what people did, here's who they leveraged, and found that a lot of the most successful collaborations were based on those early HIV, collaborations when they were responding to that crisis. So, and I loved, Marcella, like what you said about like not only who decides when the crisis is over, but who actually defines the crisis, right? It isn't, and I think that, by engaging more and more in community, you understand that they have been, especially our communities of color, in crisis for years, decades, centuries in some cases. You know, I just earlier today was listening to Jeffrey Canada. It's like, you know how long he has been at Harlem Children's Zone? Over 30 years. And this is still a question, like, should we be supporting kids and, you know, these communities in this comprehensive and, you know, all-inclusive way? And I don't believe, it's very frustrating to hear the same questions being asked over and over again. It's like, yes, we have to get beyond the questions and the rhetoric and get to action.
Yeah.
And Nora, to your point, get to action and stay there. Right. I think the fatigue in, well, we've been working on this for X number of years. Why aren't we there yet? I want to switch to something else. Chris, come on, jump in. I see you like antsy over there.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. I feel seen. And part of it has to do with perfectionism, right? And let's name that as a dimension of white supremacy culture, right? Like there's that document that's around out there about the different characteristics of white supremacy culture, and along things like objectivity and worship of the written word and individualism is perfectionism, right? And so that dimension is hard, and part of it has to do with, honestly, the profile of the types of people that foundations hire. Like, a lot of people like me tend to get hired, have a PhD, came up within the field that I program funding toward, and you know, I'm Latino, but you know, I present as white and I sound like the way that I sound, and like, you know, there's a reason someone like me, you know, fits in well at a foundation period, just because of the types of culture and academic culture that a lot of us come from. So, you know, it was mentioned earlier about the diversity of boards, and you know, our board looks good from a racial and ethnic perspective, but there was an article about this in the Chronicle of Philanthropy that our CEO was quoted in. Like, our socioeconomic diversity on our board at that point was not great. You know, that a lot of folks, you know, had degrees from advanced institutions and came from either of the coasts, right? So that it's a continual process of understanding where the shortcomings are and where the additional perspectives that you need are. It feels like this last year was a lot about vision, right? Both like seeing the world more clearly and looking in the mirror. And it feels like it's important for there to be a good balance of looking in the mirror for foundations about how we're constituted, how we recruit, and what our internal cultures look like. So much of that is what drives these downstream decisions that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Can I add one other thing that came up for me when I listening to you, Chris? We ask who's on the board because there's concentrated power there.
Right.
And I think the other question we need to be asking beyond who's on the board is, why isn't the power distributed in a different way? So something we've been doing, and it started just in our programming work and grant making, is collaborative grant making with community advisory councils in a way where there is a clear 50-50 split in decision making on funding between program staff and our advisory group. And so we try to get very exacting and what we mean when we say we're applying a racial equity lens in a way where you can point to it and say it is right there. But your question around different types of diversity and experience and kind of socioeconomics on the board, I think is critical. And there's a question of power that also has to be part of that conversation.
I want to thank each of you and ask each of you for a 30-second, and Ellie and Naomi, feel free to join in or not. And you don't have to keep the, you know, neutral researcher hat on if you don't want to. 30 seconds of one thing you want to get across to an audience of other funders on January 12th, 2021. 30 seconds, what is one thing you would want them to know or think about before I thank all of you again and we close out?
Okay, because I don't like following rules, I'm going to tell you two things. One, there's this thing that my dad used to say when I was growing up, which was, no hay que llegar primero, pero que hay que saber llegar. You don't have to get there first, but you have to know how to get there. And enough rhetoric. Let's work it. Let's do it. It's time.
Thank you, Nora.
Go for it, Marcella.
Okay, I was just going to share a couple of thoughts that came to mind as you were speaking. The first thing is trust community leadership. The second is you're not doing enough. Just internalize that. You are not doing enough. And learn and do at the same time.
Excellent. Thank you.
I'll build on learn and do at the same time. Thinking back over the last 4 or 5 years, the things that have made the most difference internally and in the communities that we serve have been big institution-wide commitments that we named, started doing, and then built the capacity to do and the skill and the knowledge to do along the way. It required learning by, learning and stumbling and figuring it out and making mistakes and being accountable. But yeah, that's where we've moved the ball down the field when we did that.
Excellent. Ellie or Naomi, anything you would want to say to the audience that you didn't get a chance to say?
Yes, I would just say, please do not lose momentum. We heard things in the interviews for this study. We saw things in the survey data for this study that we have not seen in our other research in the almost 20 years that we've existed as an organization about changes that foundations are motivated to make and that they're trying to make. And please do not lose the momentum.
Great. Thank you. Naomi?
Echoing what everybody else said, I think I'll bring in a quote from one of the foundation leaders that we interviewed that is in the second report in the study that just underscores the importance of taking action and also of systems change and policy engagement. This leader says, "The movement for Black lives is the policy agenda of the moment. We've seen funders give tens of millions of dollars to support the Affordable Care Act, marriage equality, and fair share taxes. Those were deemed important enough to raise the alarm bells on. Philanthropy needs to support organizations that advance the movement for Black lives policy agenda."
Great. So I think those were great words to close on. I want to thank again, Ellie and Naomi. A ton of work went into the gathering of all this data, all the interviews and surveys. The entire research team at CEP obviously contributed. Thanks again to Chris and the Ford Foundation for supporting this effort. And actually, it was the Ford Foundation's idea, and we were happy to do it, to try to track the level of change. Chris, Marcella, and Nora, I think you just contributed so much to our ability to kind of make sense of this data and use it, like I said at the outset, use what happened in 2020, to look back at that as a way to look forward at what is needed now. And let's not get complacent and let's not get inured to the suffering. So thank you, everybody. Thanks to all who logged on. I think a recording will go out for those who registered. Thanks for being with us today. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.